So, how can reading fiction help me in my own life and help me as a member of the Brescia family to support the Brescia community? I think to start answering that question, the first thing we need to do is kind of dive into that and say what that question means. So, the first part, how can reading fiction help me in my own life? To me, that means how can reading fiction help me become a better person, better overall. That's kind of what I'm getting for it. I don't think anybody's gonna read fiction to be on time to work more and stuff like that. So I think that's kind of what I'm gonna focus on throughout this. How can reading fiction help me in my own life? And the same thing kind of goes for and help me as a member of the Brescia family to support the Brescia community. I think to become a better person, you're more apt to be a better member of the Brescia family and to better support the Brescia community. So that's kind of what I'm getting from that question. Overall, kind of like a similar question, how can reading fiction help me be a better person? Is kind of going to be the theme of this. Just to make it easier to grade, I kind of want to start on just going through as many sources, as many stories as I possibly can, and then after getting through the majority of the material, using all of that to fully answer that question. So just to dive right in, the first reading I have, they're in no particular order, is Samuel by Grace Paley. It's the story inside Reading Short Stories. It introduces main characters that are, quote, afraid of nothing. That quote's from page 1231. That, to me, that character flaw, afraid of nothing, a lot of people interpret that as a good thing. You know, people that are afraid of nothing, they're fearless, they're courageous. But Grace Paley kind of takes that in the opposite direction. They're afraid of nothing to the point to where Samuel ends up dying, and that obviously that's a character flaw. If you do something so much that your character dies, so I think that really hammers in a point that too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. I think that's something to keep in mind. The next story I have, Literary Theory and Critical Perspectives. The way we analyze a story, as well as the perspectives we read a story from, can affect the way we as readers interpret a piece of literature. There are a ton of glosses, a ton of criticisms to use. Literary Theory and Critical Perspectives actually says, quote, those criticisms, quote, offer some useful perspectives to consider in your critical thinking and writing about literature, end quote. It's on page 1292. That to me just kind of hammered in a point that fiction or literature as a whole even is personal. It depends on the person that's reading it, what mindset they're in while they're reading it. You can get a lot of different viewpoints, a lot of different messages, a lot of different morals from any sort of story, just depending on who you are, what mood you're in, why you're reading it, how you're reading it, and a ton of other factors. So I think fiction or literature as a whole is so much more personal than just, oh, this story has one meaning or this story has this. I think any story can have a variety of meanings to different people that may be able to help them in different ways. From technique in writing the short story, I say, or they say, so how do authors typically write about heroes? As found in Technique in Writing a Short Story, authors should keep in mind that, quote, best of all, it is to avoid depicting the hero's state of mind. You ought to try to make it clear from the hero's actions. So that's kind of a piece to writers on how to better write heroes. To me, I think that has a good point in it because, you know, if we're living a life in first person. Everything we see, everything we view, touch, everything we do is from a first person perspective. It's from us. So when we're thinking about our life as a whole, I think we always kind of put ourselves as the hero in that story. I think we're the main character in all of our own life stories. So I think it's cool to kind of take a step back and look at that from a different viewpoint on how people better write heroes, because we are, in a sense, a hero when we think about ourselves. When we read How to Read Literature, it says, quote, literary works may best be seen not as text with a fixed sense, but as matrices capable of generating a whole range of possible meanings, end quote. I think that's huge. That's kind of what I said earlier. You're never going to find a piece of fiction or any piece of writing where everybody in the world is going to agree this is the singular point of this story. especially when you're talking about literature. There's going to be a variety of meanings. It goes back to the different glosses you read it from, who's reading it. There's going to be a ton of different meanings in there, which is why I think that question is so broad. How can reading fiction help me in my own life? But I also think, in that sense, that makes that question a little bit easier to answer. How can reading fiction help me in my own life? When I am reading something and I'm personally looking at it through a first person view, or through my own perspective is probably a better way of saying that, I'm going to get a different meaning from that text, from any story, than a lot of other people will. At least in some sense, in some little way. So reading fiction, to me, shows me that I kind of need to be more selfless. I want to try to get out of my own perspective. I don't want to look at things through that first person view where I'm the hero of the story, I'm right, everybody else is wrong. I think that kind of leads people to be self-centered, a little unfair in some situations. I think to be a better person, I think fiction can really help you see things outside of your own perspective, which is kind of the biggest thing you can do for yourself. Realize that your actions, your words are one of many, that you are one of many, and that there are 7 billion other people just like me. Not exactly, but there are 7 billion other people just out there. They all have different thoughts. I think once people recognize that and they start seeing that nothing is from your own perspective, it really helps people, really helped me grow. Next story I have is The Elements of Fiction. The first person narrator is, quote, making us aware as we read his or her story that the account is skewed and we can't quite trust the point of view, end quote. That ties a lot into a lot of problems with people seeing things from only one perspective or not trying to step into other people's shoes. If you can't trust a viewpoint in a story, I don't think that gives anybody any right to trust their own. And that's kind of what it showed me. If we're reading something that has a first-person narrator, I don't know if that's true because it's coming from one point of view instead of an omniscient narrator or somebody that knows exactly what's going on. I thought that was really powerful because we all visualize everything from a first-person point of view. We're all seeing it through our own eyes, through our own perspectives, and I think just that little hint fiction gives us that, hey, that perspective can be wrong. I think that showed me quite a bit. I have a quote from The Prisoner on the Hell Planet. It says, quote, I felt confused, I felt angry, I felt numb, end quote. That was on page 873. They also have another quote. It says, quote, Hitler did it, end quote. I want to kind of tie that into our historical gloss, things that were going around at the time. That story was written from a particular point of view with particular things going around or happening in the world that definitely affected it. And I think if stories can have all of these different factors that affect what they mean or how they're written, I think the same thing applies to people and their viewpoints. And the first quote, I felt confused, I felt angry, I felt numb, I think that just kind of describes more of the first person narrator type style. He's feeling all of these feelings that will definitely affect the way the story's told, what happens in the story. So I think that just kind of hammers down the point that we view everything from a first person narration point of view. And we can't trust it. So I need to make more of like a conscious switch to kind of try to see things from other people's own perspectives. The Story of an Hour is next. We remember what that one's about. Miss Mallard receives news of her husband's death. She goes to reflect alone, and then she realizes that she's free to live her life without her husband. She even says the quote, free, 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 end quote, on page 231. She gets happier and happier after that, and then her husband walks through the front door, and he was never dead. He didn't even know there had been an accident, and Miss Mallard sees him and dies of a heart attack. that one, I mean, that one blew me away. I didn't ever picture her at the end of the story. At first, I didn't picture her being happy about her husband's death, and then I didn't picture her being so upset that he was still alive that she would just die of shock. Um, Edgar Allan Poe stated, in the composition of a rhymed poem not to exceed in length what might be pursued in an hour, end quotes, on page 1097. That kind of, he has a couple more quotes about that, but he's just kind of talking about a long poem is a paradox. If you're going to write a poem as opposed to a different type of literature, you kind of need to keep it short, sweet, simple. Next, I'm going to go to An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. The story begins with the protagonist, Peyton Farquhar, being placed into a noose on Owl Creek Bridge. He's trying to burn it down. This one was one of my favorite stories. You know, he goes through all of these flashbacks. He escapes from the bridge. He runs home. He runs into his wife's arms, and then boom, he wakes up, and the noose has just snapped around his neck, and the whole thing was a hallucination. That to me, again, just hammers down that first person narration can't be trusted. You know, we're seeing everything from Peyton Farquhar's point of view. And it's just wrong. It's stuff that's not happening, which brings up bigger questions when, you know, we try to relate that to real life. Can we trust our surroundings? Can we trust what we see, hear? Can we trust our own perspectives? So things that we are positive about, things that we know, things that we see, things that we perceive, may not be real. They have an equal chance of just being false, us coming up with them as they do being real. So I think, to me, that shows me that things that I am 100% sure about, you know, in an argument, maybe, for example, I kind of need to take a step back and realize that there's absolutely a chance that those things cannot be true, cannot be right. I'm perceiving them differently than what they actually are. I think that helped me grow a lot as a person. So in Gendering Heroism, Time Van Oscillator brings up, you know, Catholic predispositions to what a hero should be. I think that's really important because I personally have my own viewpoint of what a hero should be, but I think it's really important, you know, again, for me to see things from outside my own perspective. So it's nice being able to see what the Catholic hero should look like, because there are a lot of Catholics in the world, and that just proves to me that there's a lot of people that view what a hero is that are, their definition is nothing like what my definition is. Heroes and Villains by David Robson. He goes through the different definitions of what a hero is, what a villain is, but he doesn't just stick to like a Catholic viewpoint of it. He goes through as many different definitions as he can, and that to me just proves, you know, he goes through a huge number of definitions for heroes and villains, what each can mean, and I just came out of reading that a little more confused than I did going in. You know, the more you know, the wider your horizon of things that you don't know are, and that's kind of how I felt about that. Just that there's so many different definitions for what a hero or a villain could be, proved to me that there's a lot of different meanings people can get out of a text. When I read something, it's not going to be the same thing as when other people read anything, which again just pushes me more towards the argument that I should try to see things outside of my own perspective. So I'd like to dive into A Rose for Emily. Just going to go straight into the quote from it. Quote, "One of us lifted something from it," they're talking about the pillow, "and leaning forward, that a faint and invisible dust dry and acrid in the nostrils, we saw a long strand of iron gray hair." End quote. It's on page 320. I know you remember what that's talking about. That was a powerful moment in that story where they find out that Emily has been sleeping next to her deceased lover for however long they didn't know. That one more kind of just blew my mind with how did the author come up with that story? What was going on in their head that they had that thought and converted it to pen and paper? What was it? Something related to their past? Did it have anything to do with how they were raised? I think we can ask the same sort of gloss questions we ask ourselves when we're reading as we can about how the author came up with that story. which was just blew my mind in that A Rose for Emily case. The next one I have, where are you going, where have you been? Quote, this is how it is, honey. You come out and we'll drive away. Have a nice ride. But if you don't come out, we're going to wait till your people come home and then they're all going to get it. End quote. It's on page 692. That one to me, she's feeling helpless. She does what she does. She goes with them to save her family, or what she thinks is saving her family or helping her family, keeping them out of harm's way. But by doing so, she put herself directly into harm's way. So that is kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place on that one. And that one, to me, I kind of pictured myself in that same tough situation. What would I do? How would I react? And I honestly couldn't answer. That's a tough situation to be in. But I think that's kind of what fiction does for people. It takes people out of their own perspectives and puts them into other people's perspectives, even if those other people are fictional characters in a story, which I think is really important for personal growth. I think as a functioning adult, I should be able to see things from other people's perspectives, which is hard. It's something to be learned, but I think if you want to be a better overall person, if I want to be a better overall person, I need to constantly be seeing things from other people's perspectives. It's not just me living my life. It's everybody, 7 billion other people right now doing the exact same thing. The perspective isn't mine. It's the world's, if that makes sense. The Lone Ranger and Tonto fist fight in heaven. He says, quote, witnesses. They were all witnesses and nothing more. For hundreds of years, Indians were witnesses to crimes of an epic scale. Victor's uncles were in the midst of a misdemeanor that would remain one even if somebody was to die. One Indian killing another kind of storm. This little kind of hurricane was generic. It didn't even deserve a name. End quote. That was my favorite quote from the story. That's why I picked that one. But I think that kind of just shows, again, the helplessness. You're stuck between a rock and a hard place. There's nothing you can do. You are powerless, which I think on a deeper level, metaphorically, we've all kind of experienced in our own life. We're going to be put in situations that I don't really know how to react to, that I'm not used to, or that I might be helpless to stop, which I think everybody, me especially, I really needed to hear that and learn that. Sweat by Zora Neale Hurston. She's just talking about how I have a quote from that actually. Work and sweat, cry and sweat, pray and sweat, end quote. And that just kind of shows that all she does, between everything she does, she is working, she is sweating, she everything that she does takes energy. It's work. Which I think was a good lesson for me as well, because everything that you do is going to have some level of work to it. Everything important, at least in my opinion, you're going to have to work for. Isaac Rodman in Irony and Isolation, Narrative Distance, and Faulkner's A Rose for Emily. Obviously, he's diving into A Rose for Emily. He brings up the presence of a deeper narrator, which as soon as I read that, it's like a light bulb went off in my head. He talked about how literary inclined readers can see that deeper narrator and the different things that deeper narrator implies. But that to me immediately was just proof that two people could read that story and get two completely different meanings. A literary inclined reader, as he would call it, would get one way different meaning about two separate narrators, a deeper narrator, while somebody like me would just read that and get that story generally as what it was. Sonny's Blues. He says, quote, I couldn't believe it, but what I mean by that is that I couldn't find any room for it anywhere inside me. I'd kept it outside of me for a long time. I hadn't wanted to know, end quote. Which I think is really powerful, because he recognizes that he knew it, but he couldn't find any room inside of him to hold it. He couldn't believe it, and he just didn't want to know. which I think brings up a valid point for people in their own lives, me especially. If there's things that I'm biased towards, I might not recognize that I'm biased towards them. I might keep them outside of me. Things that I don't want to hear, I might not hear. I might keep them outside of me. Things that are uncomfortable, which, things that are uncomfortable are usually the things that lead to growth, personal, mental, physical, anything. If it's uncomfortable, it's probably good for you. Truth Fiction and True Fiction by Shannon Burns brings up the different things that can shape a story as the author's writing it. Truth, fiction, and true fiction. There's truth. There's things that have actually happened. They're nonfiction. There's fiction, things that are completely made up, and then there's that entire gray area in between of true fiction, things that are based on real life that are actually they're not real, they didn't really happen, but they're based, they have footholds in the truth. And I think that as well, helps us tie in more of like a historical gloss, a cultural gloss, things that are actually going on in the world that these stories are based off of. I think a lot of it is because those stories have a basis in truth. The things they carried, Tim O'Brien says, quote, "He understood. It was very sad, he thought, the things men carried inside, the things men did or felt they had to do," end quote. It's on page 708. And that he is referring to, he understands he's about to lead his battalion into a battle in which they will all die. He doesn't know that at this point, but that's kind of where he understands the gravity of the situation that he's in. Everything up until then has been kind of a joke to him, more or less. And that's when, when he's put in charge, it just hits him. The whole story is about the things that they carry, their backpacks, their gear. And then right at the end, right before they all die, he realizes what they actually carry, the gravity of the situation, which, in my opinion, he realizes just a little too late. So I think that story personally helps me by, I always need to be looking at my surroundings, looking at things from other people's perspective, what is actually going on. August 2026, There Will Come Soft Rains. I think this ties into a cultural gloss more or less. It kind of, it's talking about a nuclear apocalypse, something most people are uncomfortable reading about, and it kind of forces people to see things from outside of their own perspectives. It's not something that people would just think about. Tying that into cultural gloss, I think that has a lot to do with where you're from, where you were raised, how you were raised, especially in regards to writing and understanding that story. Nuclear apocalypse isn't something that people are really going to understand in third world developing countries, that kids aren't going to understand yet. So I think who you are, how you were raised, definitely has a lot to do with what you get from that story. Barbecue includes themes of poverty and being thankful for everything, which was, kind of a twist that I really like to see in a story. Those two little girls get new Barbies because a factory burned down. Me personally, I was born into a middle class family, so I always had nicer things. I didn't struggle. I didn't know where my next meal was going to come from or anything like that. But that just goes to show that there are people out there that the only reason these two girls got toys was because a factory burned down. They got charred, melted Barbies, and they were super happy about them. So that just goes to show, outside of your own perspective, if I got a Barbie when I was little, say if I was into that, I wouldn't care, because I was surrounded by a family and in a setting that had that. Whereas these people are just overwhelmed that they have charred and melted Barbies, which kind of took me out of my own perspective again. The Lottery, that one was rough. It's kind of a darker story. I think ties in a lot with reader response gloss. I had a couple friends that I've talked about this story with, and they've read it before, and it seemed like the story had a really powerful, emotional kick to it from what I got just from talking to my friends about it. I talked to them before I had read the story, actually. And obviously, and it does. They pick the kid out, they stone him to death, and it's just what a different society could be like. It kind of dives into the darker side of human nature, which isn't something that you really read, see, or hear about a lot of the times. Going on with that, A White Heron kind of shows beauty in nature. It's about that little girl's perspective on how she loves the white heron. Um, and it kind of goes into a little depth on how different people interact with nature in different ways. On kind of a sort of deeper level, I think it shows more individuality, how some people can clash with others based on their own perspectives, their own opinions, their own biases, and how there's not necessarily a good or a bad guy. There are just people with different viewpoints that feel very strongly about it. The Gift of the Magi, I also think ties into cultural gloss just because it revolves around Christmas. If you're not from somewhere that really has sort of a Christmas culture like we do here in the United States, I think that story is going to be a lot harder to understand. You don't really get the emotional pull of that time of the year or anything like that. Also, it originates from Western cultures with an ideology of Christmas, so I think it kind of is written for that audience. Not saying that people not in that audience can't enjoy the story, but the major themes of it, I think, revolve around selflessness. But the interesting twist in it is that you can be too selfless. The main characters give away gifts. They have to spend so much on them that the girl sacrifices her hair. Her husband got her something for her hair. They both sacrifice things that make their gifts useless to each other. So in reality, they didn't give each other material things. It was just the thought that somebody would give up their most prized possession to get me something. I think that was kind of the biggest gift in the story. The Veil, I think, ties into gender and feminist glosses. It tells a story about women who struggle to express their own individualism due to cultural norms in their country. They're not allowed to express themselves. They're not allowed to, go out in public. They always have to wear a veil. I think that goes to show that people should at least be allowed to express their own individualism. At the very least, in a perfect world, everybody gets along with everybody. To do that, I think we all need to have this sense of seeing things outside our own perspective. We are not the hero of our own life story. There are so many other things happening that my life is not that important in the grand scheme of things. I think that one ties a lot into Harrison Bergeron. I think it's really similar to The Veil in the sense that people aren't allowed to express themselves. People are handicapped. Everybody is put down at the bottom level of society so that everybody can be equal. I liked that one because I think it showed an extreme case of equality that actually doesn't really benefit anybody. Nobody really seems happy in that story. So I think that just goes to show that true equality can't really be achieved. And if it can, like it is in Harrison Bergeron, it's not going to be something pretty that it's not going to be the go-to that we're all thinking about. It's going to be something else completely. The Little Match Girl. Hans Christian Andersen just kind of, he's good at writing stories that mess me up. I should have known The Little Match Girl was going to end like that after The Little Mermaid, but I do overall think it's a good story, and it shows some interesting things about life. It deals with some really big questions that everybody's probably asked themselves before, like what happens when I die? And Hans Christian Andersen takes a different viewpoint from that. The little girl sees things that she wants to. She sees, a New Year's dinner. She sees the Christmas tree. And then last of all, she sees her grandma as she's freezing to death. She's seeing all these things as she's lighting off matches. And when she sees her grandma, she wants her grandma so bad that she just lights off the whole bundle of matches and her grandma takes her with her. Lo and behold, this girl is frozen to death. And all of those were what I assumed to be hallucinations. But I think the story itself does bring up interesting questions, like what happens when I die. I think that kind of helps me in my own life because you don't really have conversations like that with people. You know, I don't talk to my friends, hey, what happens when we die? You know, so I think it's cool to see authors' viewpoints on stuff like that when them expressing those questions, even if it's subtly in pieces of literature. Um, the next story I have is looking back on girlhood. I think that one ties kind of into a formalistic gloss. Sarah Orne Jewett dives into her childhood and she discusses different things she grew up around. I think that provides a level of formalistic gloss that we aren't really used to. You know, formalistic gloss, age, sex, location, who is the author at the most basic level. That can give you some really brief information on why they may have written that story. But when she goes into her childhood and she talks about all the things she grew up around, I think that kind of gives you a bigger picture of a more simple formalistic gloss, which I really thought was neat. Happy endings. I thought that was a great story. You know, they start with the one happy ending, and no matter what the details of the story are, it keeps revolving around to that one same happy ending. To me, I kind of took that personally as like a reminder to breathe. Everything's going to turn out fine. There's a lot of things you can't control, but in the end, I think that's a deeper metaphor for things will always return to that happy ending. The two biggest sources for me, does reading fiction boost empathy? A journal in which they did a study and they found that readers that read fiction are actually more empathetic than those who do not. And that was just, you know, a basic study, but then they tie that towards an empathetic ethics of fiction reading, where it's called Empathy and the Strangeness of Fiction, Readings and French Realism, where they go more into it and they say empathetic, you know, kind of from the other side, people that are more empathetic are more likely to get different variations of a story. They're more likely to see the bigger picture of a story. So it kind of goes both ways with that. So diving back in straight into two questions, I think that story majorly revolves around self-confidence. You know, she's asking herself all these questions about, is this good, is it bad, and stuff like that. And she just kind of loses confidence in her work. I think the biggest moral to take away from that story for me personally is just to believe in myself, keep my head down, keep working, and that I shouldn't really have doubts about whatever it is that I'm working on. Paul's case left me kind of with the biggest question. The biggest question I had when I was done reading it was, is a proper education the right thing for everybody? It kind of seems to me like school and the whole system's failing him, not really helping him. It seems like they don't really understand Paul at all. They just kind of want him to conform. Battle Royale brings up a lot of topics regarding racism, which to me ties in a lot of things about seeing things from outside of my own perspective. Relates, you know, kind of to How to Be Colored Me, in the sense that racism is a huge major focus. Both of those have similar talking points to me. The influence of folklore on Battle Royale. He talks about how the narrator's path is from ignorance to enlightenment. So in that story, when they're talking about racism and all that, that commentary just shows how his path is from ignorance to enlightenment, or from dark to light, as they call it. Yellow Woman really stuck out to me because the woman in the story already knew what was going to happen. They start off Yellow Woman by her telling the story of the Yellow Woman, and she knew what was going to happen to her. She foreshadowed the entire thing, even though she's the one that was the one foreshadowing. She already knew, she recognized that that man was going to come get her to live with them, and that she would never return home. I think the biggest thing for me to take away from that is that sometimes going with the flow isn't always the right decision, and that I should always be cautious about the repercussions my actions might have, no matter what they are. How Angela Carter became feminism's great mythologist. Carter's known for taking popular stories and rewriting them with different endings. She's also really hugely focused on the empowerment of minority groups and the female population. So to me, I think that kind of ties in with like a gender feminist gloss. Of course, that one is the commentary, so that one they're reading that through a feminist gloss. Um, Autobiographical Notes by James Baldwin shows us a little more insight into his life and his writing of Sonny's Blues. He talked about how he had, not a great childhood. He loved to read everything except the Bible, actually, because that was the only book anybody ever wanted him to read. But he always, he made it a habit to read to his siblings because he thought it was that important, and he still does. A feminist reading of Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper brings in a feminist gloss to the reading of The Yellow Wallpaper. We also get more insight into the story through Gilbert and Dubar describing the characters' postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis. So that just gives you a little bit more background information into it. The Yellow Wallpaper, we get a metaphor of the yellow wallpaper being ugly, yet representing women in the 1900s being forced into societal norms. It's not something that everybody wants, but it is there and it's not pretty. The Morning of June 28th, 1948, and The Lottery. That gives us more insight into Shirley Jackson's mourning the day the lottery was published. She was terrified that her story was going to be shown to strangers, and that kind of stuck with me personally because we all broadcast, we go out in public and we're talking to people or we're just being ourselves. We broadcast all that information to strangers every single day, and that's what she was worried about. The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. This story revolves around suffering and how other people try to gain from the suffering of others, which is something that I don't personally believe in, but I can relate to it in the sense that everybody suffered at some point in their lives. I think it's interesting because it includes people that don't agree with the process. And, the people that walk away from Omelas, they're the ones that don't agree with it. So I like the story in that sense that it includes both sides of the argument. The Scapegoat in Omelas brings up an interesting conversation regarding ideals and how people typically learn more from the past than they do from the future. The biggest question I had after reading that was, could hard times make people have stronger morals in the long run? Could hard times make people into better people, if that makes sense? I think that commentary really has an argument that bad things are going to happen and that people could be stronger from them. At least that's what I took from it. Alpha Company Tim O'Brien describes Vietnam as a vacation, and it was all fun and games. I think that to me was just huge because nobody thinks about Vietnam and they're like, oh, that must have been super fun for all those soldiers out there, but that's how he describes it. He literally describes it as fun and games and a vacation. And I think that's just, pointing to me that if you look through something if I look at something through my own perspective, there's an absolute chance that it could be wrong. In no way do I believe Tim O'Brien when he says that Vietnam was fun and games and it was like a vacation. I think Tim O'Brien did not perceive Vietnam as what it actually was from what I've heard. So to me, that just shows that I need to be looking at things from other people's perspectives, from anything but my own, if that makes sense. Reading The Veil by Marjane Satrapi. The Veil is described as a coming-of-age story surrounded by cultural and societal reformation. When they describe it like that, that just kind of, further proves the point of, how the veil was pressing against them. They weren't allowed to express their individuality, and I think that ties into Harrison Bergeron a lot too, where people are handicapped. All those kind of have similar themes to me. So the biggest thing I would say to take away from all of those stories is that my perspective is one of many. It's not important in any way whatsoever. How can reading fiction help me in my own life? just that, seeing things from outside of my own perspective. Reading fiction allows me to look at things from other points of view. It allows me to put myself in scenarios that I never would have had the creative ability to come up with on my own. And I think that ties a lot into how I can better serve the Brescia community and be a better member of the Brescia family as well. Because if I can't be a functioning better person on my own, then there's no way I can improve the Brescia community, something much larger than myself. So overall, I would say the biggest thing fiction can do to help me in my own life, or to help me better serve the Brescia community, it's just a constant reminder that my own point of view is not important. I always need to be looking at the bigger picture.